They say that the best form of flattery is imitation, and that statement rings true particularly when we talk about arcade hardware. This obscure piece of hardware is known as the IGS PGM, short for Polygame Master, and for all intents and purposes looks to be very similar to a one-slot NeoGeo MVS, right down to the cartridge system and exact same Motorola 68000 and Zilog Z80 processors powering the hardware. Now you may have guessed, like the NeoGeo, the IGS PGM is a 2D powerhouse, but while there are similarities, there's also quite a few differences. And in today's episode, we are going to take a closer look at the world of the IGS PGM and what makes the hardware so unique and such a love letter to the original NeoGeo. The Taiwan-based IGS PGM is an intriguing piece of hardware that has seen over the years some of its games brought to home consoles, including ones you may not be familiar with. The hardware would originally release in 1997, and that's 7 years after the NeoGeo, and this would mark an interesting time in arcade games. You see, when it came to arcade games in Western countries, 3D was all the rage, and 2D was well and truly on the way out. This would seem on paper to be a very odd design choice. Around the same time as the launch of the IGS PGM Arcade Hardware, the PlayStation-based Namco System 11 and 12 hardware were dominating the arcades with games like Tekken 3, not to mention the Sega Model 2 hardware that powers the legendary Daytona USA. But the IGS PGM would be released in 1997, and the question is why? In the USA, it would have been a disaster. However, in Asian markets like Taiwan, arcades would host many MVS and Capcom CPS2 games, and IGS would take inspiration from the NeoGeo hardware but improve upon it in certain areas. The NeoGeo houses a Motorola 68000 running at 12 MHz as well as a Zilog Z80 at 4 MHz. It also has a resolution of 320 by 224 as well as 4096 colors on screen with a 16-bit color palette. And finally, the legendary Yamaha YM206010 is the sound chip. Now let's compare that to the IGS PGM. It houses the exact same Motorola 68000 but this time running at 20 MHz, the same Zilog Z80 running at 8.5 MHz, but this time controls a Wavefront ICS 2115 chip which runs up to 32 sample audio channels. This particular chip was used in quite a few ISA-based sound cards back in the day, as well as wavetable synthesizer daughter cards. And I gotta say, it sounds impressive. As a comparison, let's take a listen to some NeoGeo YM206010 goodness. And then take a listen to the Wavefront chip. Both sound great in their own right, and I suspect that IGS decided to use the Wavefront chip over the Yamaha chip to reduce overall cost of manufacturing. We also need to mention the screen resolution. On the IGS PGM, it's running at 448 by 224. This slight increase in horizontal resolution stretches out the screen pixels ever so slightly, and rather than a 4:3 aspect ratio, it's a 2:1 aspect ratio. Interesting choice. And of course, if we side by side the IGS PGM and a Slot 1 MVS NeoGeo board, you can see the immediate similarities between the two pieces, right down to the cartridge slot, which is very similar, and even offer the same dual PCBs as the NeoGeo. On top of this, the IGS PGM also features the same 4-button jammer pinout, so there is no additional kick harness required. This is very much in line with the NeoGeo. Now when it comes to the cartridges, there are similarities. However, the PGM is slightly larger with a beveled edge, so you can't just put a game in around the wrong way. And I should also note here that there is no compatibility between the IGS PGM and the NeoGeo. While very similar, they aren't the same. In fact, the IGS PGM has a lot more going on that meets the eye. Now when it comes to the graphics, I did mention that the IGS PGM is a 2D powerhouse, and it absolutely is. Not only does it run faster with more clocks than the NeoGeo, it also comes with some enhancements. For example, the NeoGeo is not capable of zooming sprites, but it can scale them. The PGM can handle zooming just fine. It also features 32 color sprites that can be any size. This is in comparison to the NeoGeo, which can only handle 16 color sprites. There's also 32 pixel by 32 pixel scrolling tile maps that supports individual line scrolling. And the result of all this cool 2D hardware is that many 2D games on the IGS PGM look very colourful and very vibrant, and don't suffer from the same slowdowns as the NeoGeo hardware. Now based on everything that we've said so far, other than the sound chip, it seems like the IGS PGM is pretty much a replica of the NeoGeo, and that's where it gets its reputation. However, there is more that makes up the DNA of the IGS PGM, and that has to do with an ARM7 coprocessor that runs at around 20 MHz. Now those with a good eye and know what they're looking for will notice there is no ARM7 chip at all on the motherboard. Instead, this chip is on board most, but not all, IGS PGM cartridges. The main purpose of this chip is for copy protection, but to be very clear, it's not the only purpose of it. Specific games have different uses for the ARM7 coprocessor, and we'll get to that shortly. Another interesting standout feature of the hardware on the side is the expansion port that allows for connectivity to introduce 3 and 4 players. Quite a few IGS PGM games do support 4 players, so this is a welcome feature. Now speaking of the games, the IGS PGM is a bit of a mixed bag. There's around 30 titles released for the PGM hardware, and the earlier releases consisted of puzzle and mahjong titles. However, heading into the 2000s, some quality titles started to appear, and here are some of my personal favorites. 1998's The Killing Blade is a traditional fighting game that is a bit of a nod to SNK's Samurai Showdown games, but The Killing Blade features a 2-on-2 tag team mechanic with 2 separate power meters, and this is a very fun game to play, and quite underrated if you're a fan of versus fighting games. 1999's Knights of Valor kicked off a very popular series, which is a side-scrolling brawler based on the Romance of the Three Kingdoms series set in medieval China. The game spawned a ton of updates, and 2000's Knights of Valor 2 would be a true sequel to the game. But no matter which version of the game that you play, Knights of Valor is a great brawler series and even better with 4 players. It has a terrific showcase of what the hardware is capable of, with very large sprites, fast action, and terrific gameplay. 2001's Martial Masters is another versus fighting game on the system. This one has 12 playable characters and 1 unplayable boss character, and it's a fun game, but what is immediately noticeable is that this game has superb hand-drawn sprites and 2D animations that take influence from the Street Fighter Alpha series. This looks like a Capcom CPS 2 or 3 title, and that's a credit to the game design and of course the hardware itself. Dodonpachi 2 B-Storm is a vertical scrolling bullet hell shoot 'em up developed by IGS and published by Capcom in 2001. Now shmup fans might be thinking, didn't Cave develop the Dodonpachi series? And yes, you would be correct. However, Cave was not involved with the development of B-Storm at all. Rather, IGS obtained the license to the Dodonpachi name for a new game to release on IGS's Polygame Master hardware. In a vacuum, B-Storm is a pretty fun shoot 'em up, but it's just a touch on the easy side. And to be clear, this is not the quality of what we would expect from a Cave game. Now I did say that Cave wasn't involved in the making of B-Storm, and this is true. What this did, however, was reinvigorate Cave, who had lost interest in the arcade business at this point and were looking to exit the business. But the success of B-Storm had convinced Cave to continue working on arcade games and to even use the IGS PGM hardware for their very own releases. And the next 3 would be some of the most legendary shoot 'em ups ever released. Dodonpachi Daioju released 1 year later, and this would be followed up with 2 shoot 'em ups that are considered a 1-2 punch of bullet hell greatness, with Espgaluda and Ketsui. All 3 games ran exclusively on IGS PGM hardware and are considered some of Cave's finest works. These games would not appear on the regular PGM cartridges. Rather, They would be individual PCBs with the IGS PGM hardware on them. This was done to stop bootlegging of the game, as there would be sophisticated copy protection on the PCBs to stop duplication. And this here is my personal Espgaluda arcade PCB. As you can see, it contains the very same hardware as the IGS PGM motherboard, including the game ROMs and the ASIC protection hardware. IGS would also offer separate PCBs for other titles that would release later on. The 3 Cave PGM shoot-em-ups would all receive various home console ports for the very first time. DDP Diaju and Espgaluda would be ported to the PS2 and Xbox 360. Ketsui would release for the Nintendo DS, PlayStation 3 and 4, as well as the Xbox 360. Demon Front is another game that was offered in both cartridge and single PCB format, and this is a Metal Slug clone, make no mistake, but it's a damn good one. Arriving around the time of Metal Slug 4, which was considered a bit of a disappointment, Demon Front never manages to equal the appeal of the earlier Metal Slug games, but it's a fun clone with its own charm and its own game mechanics, and it's definitely worth checking out if you've never played it before. Spectral vs. Generation is perhaps the most well-known IGS PGM game outside of the cave shooters. It's a fighting game with a focus on combos and slow time mechanics. The game was ported to the PlayStation 2 and PSP by Ideas Factory, and is considered a pretty good fighting game overall, and one worth checking out if you're a fan of the genre. And finally, last but not least, is The Gladiator. Releasing in 2001, a year just after Demon Front, this is a side-scroller brawler, and it's one of the best IGS PGM games and one of the most underrated brawling games you'll ever play. With its amazing design, controls, animations, especially the characters, and the execution here is all fantastic. There are 6 playable characters with their own unique styles and special attacks. There's also a parry mechanic with mid-air specials and counters. I mean, all this stuff belongs in a fighting game rather than a brawler. And as you play, you earn scrolls that offer completely new moves, and you can switch between different fighting techniques. This can give you the edge when fighting bosses, and you can quickly switch back to your regular fighting style at any time. And once again, this game supports 4 players. Make no mistake, The Gladiator is one of the very best games that you've probably never heard of, and if you haven't, you should at least check it out. Compared to the NeoGeo, the IGS PGM protection system was quite sophisticated, and took many years for IGS PGM games to be considered playable in emulators such as MAME. The ARM7 was a custom chip with its own special unique ROM, and each individual game had unique use cases on how to use the ARM7. For example, many of them would form the copy protection of the IGS PGM hardware, but some games would also use the ARM7 as the main processor and rely on the 68000 to be somewhat of the co-processor. Additionally, games such as the cave shooters, including B-Storm, would also use the ARM7 chip to handle its bullet processing to manage bullet patterns and physics, leaving the 68000 to simply handle code and data processing. But because the ARM7 ASIC had its own custom ROM, dumping these ROMs were very difficult at the time. This meant that it would be possible to dump the Dodonpachi 2 ROMs and data from the 68000, but if you didn't have a ROM dump of the ARM7 ASIC that's tied to this game, playing it would simply not show any bullets on screen at all. Effectively, this is the copy protection of the hardware. And this meant at the time, the bootlegging of IGS PGM games was considered very difficult, if not impossible. Because of the custom nature of the ARM7 ASIC, it meant that the only way to get a good ROM dump of this particular chip was to use sophisticated decapping methods, which can be expensive and dangerous, at least back in the day. And as a result, because of the custom hardware being different in each game, emulation is a difficult task. IGS PGM games were not fully emulated until around 2014, when all games were considered playable in MAME. Before that, reverse engineering, trial and error, and some guesswork would be used to bypass the copy protection techniques. But this was not a one-size-fits-all approach. Many games possess their own unique challenges and their own custom ASICs. The hardware protection held up for years, and considering that the IGS PGM released in 1997, by 2014, this is an impressive feat. Now, for those people that want to play IGS PGM games in 2023, there are a couple of different options. Your best option for the moment is emulation, either via MAME or FB-Neo. Both have very comprehensive IGS PGM game support. Unfortunately, at the moment, there is no Mr. FPGA core available. I have heard some rumblings that it's currently in development, but for the moment there's been nothing officially announced. Or if you prefer the original IGS PGM Arcade motherboard, it's quite cheap. I've seen them for as low as $60. That is of course if you own a Gemma based arcade or a Supergun. The games themselves vary in price, with many being quite expensive. However, since we've had breakthroughs in dumping the ARM7 ASIC ROMs and emulation, it means that conversions and bootlegs have now flooded the market on sites such as AliExpress. There is one more option, and for those that own a Nintendo Switch, you may have seen a brand new release known as the IGS Classic Arcade Collection. This is some of the very best classic IGS games in a single bundle, including games like the Gladiator, Martial Masters, and the King of Valor games, as well as Demon Front, all for $30 in the US. Unfortunately, however, this is a missed opportunity for gamers to enjoy these IGS PGM games on console for the very first time. For starters, the audio is in bad shape, with lots of pops and crackles that indicate some type of emulation problem. But worse, that the game is presented in 16:9 widescreen support only. Now this is not a bad thing, considering the wider horizontal width of IGS PGM games means that you can get away with a stretched 16:9 aspect ratio. However, what I would really have liked to have seen is proper 2:1 aspect ratio settings, or even a simulated 4:3 aspect ratio. Unfortunately, these issues, including the bad audio, really means that I can't recommend this collection to anyone, and I am hopeful that a patch will come. In conclusion, the Polygame Master is a cheap but powerful arcade-based hardware that has excellent 2D and sound. Its release was definitely a gamble, especially in 1997, but its main focus was to tap into the low-end arcade market, and in the end it ended up being quite successful, prompting new revisions of the hardware with the PGM2 in 2007 and the PGM3 in 2010. And interestingly enough, in the end, SNK themselves would end up putting the King of Fighters 98 Ultimate Match Hero on PGM2 hardware. Putting your game on the competition is certainly a move, but the NeoGeo had already well and truly been sunset by that point. And with that, we are going to leave it here for today's episode. I do hope you enjoyed this deep dive into the world of the IGS PGM Arcade Hardware. I certainly had fun making this episode, and I hope you guys enjoyed it as well. But that's going to do it for today's episode. If you like this, please don't forget to leave me a thumbs up, leave a comment below, and I'll catch you guys in the next episode. Bye for now.